My name is Dawn Henderson, and I am the Horticulture Program Coordinator for 4 counties in the northwest corner of Iowa at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I serve Sioux, O'Brien, Lyon, and Osceola counties. I'm based out of the Rock Rapids office in Lyon County, but I cover all 4. So if you're in the area, send me a message with any questions you have. A little bit about my background. I have been with Extension almost a full year now after completing my bachelor's in agronomy at Iowa State last May. I've grown up with agriculture and horticulture and Extension all of my life, so I'm very excited to be able to do this now every day. And I'm excited to be here with all of you, even though we can't see face to face. Today, we're going to be breaking down composting just a little bit, and I'm focusing more specifically on home composting for the home gardener. There is commercial composting and composting for more of an agronomic sense. However, I'm focusing more on these small garden composts that you pull and then you apply in the fall or spring for your garden. And by the end of today, I'm hoping that you can be able to answer these 4 questions, because these are the 4 most common questions I get when it comes to composting. What do you need to compost? What makes up compost? How does it work? And why should you go through all of this trouble to set up your compost pile, take care of it all through the summer, and then go to the work to apply it to your garden? But before we even get into any of that, I always like to start with the very basic definition, so we're all on the same page, of what exactly is compost. According to Merriam-Webster, as a noun, compost is a mixture that consists largely of decayed organic matter and is used for fertilizing and conditioning the land. In other words, it is broken down plant matter that we then use to better our soil, better our land, so it's more productive for us. So starting out, you need your materials. Composting is very loose. There's more loose guidelines than hard and fast rules. So step 1, you need to have your plant material. And clearly, if you're interested in starting a compost pile, you already most likely have a source for that plant material, whether it's lawn clippings, kitchen cuttings, or spent plants out of either the vegetable or the flower garden. So if you already have that material, then the rest of it's up to you, where you put it and how you contain it. Like I said, there's mostly just loose guidelines when it comes to setting up the compost pile. It's more important what you put into it. Now, when it comes to choosing your location, there's 3 major factors that I like to consider when it comes to where you put it. The biggest one is the size. How big is it going to be? This is going to depend on how much compost waste you are producing to go into the pile. As it makes sense, if you have a larger garden with more plants that you need to pull out, or a larger yard with more grass clippings, it's going to be larger than if you're only collecting from your kitchen cuttings and breaking that kind of thing down. So that's dependent on you. The ideal size to reach the perfect temperature for a compost pile is roughly a 3 by 3 foot cube. So you can aim for that size, but it does not have to be exactly 3 foot by 3 foot. We're not breaking out the yardstick here. The next biggest concern, this is the biggest concern that I typically get from people who are looking into starting their own compost pile, and that's the smell. Particularly if you are in town and you have neighbors that might be concerned about composting. The good news is a stinky compost pile is just a sign of a mismanaged compost pile. It is actually a misconception that a compost pile should smell. We'll go through what exactly makes it smell, and we'll go through a little bit of troubleshooting of why it might smell kind of funky. But as long as you are managing your compost pile properly, there shouldn't be a smell to be concerned about. So you can assure any neighbors you have that are worried about it that there won't be any sort of rotting stench. And then the last factor is just going to be convenience. If things are convenient for you to use, you're going to use them more often, and you're going to be willing to put in that extra little bit of work, whether that's just setting your bin right outside your kitchen door, or you have a collection pot on the counter before moving it out into the yard, or if you do want to walk across that yard to get that little bit of exercise, since we're not out and about very much lately, you can set it at the end of your yard. Like I said, these are loose guidelines when it comes to setting up a compost pile, so it's very customizable to what you need. Now that you have your location selected in mind, where are you going to put it? Now we talk about how are you going to contain this pile of breaking down, decomposing vegetable and plant matter. There are a couple different options. The easiest one that requires the least amount of planning and production is what's called a passive pile. And much like the name suggests, you pile up your plant material and you just let it do its thing in a pile. There's no real structure, there's no fencing set up. For a home garden, this is not always the best option. This tends to work better in more of the commercial composting settings, or if you have a large amount of, for example, manure, say it's chicken, or you have goat droppings or anything like that in a big pile. This is where a passive pile would be more effective. As a home gardener, your better options are going to be either a commercial bin or a home-built setting that you can customize to your own set. So with the commercial bin, if you do any minute of research online, you will find dozens and dozens of options. So there is absolutely something to fit exactly what you need. There are rolling bins that you can use and turn that are very, very small, all the way up to 50-gallon drums. There are stackables, there's plastic, there's wood. Like I said, if you do a little bit of research, you will find something that fits your needs. The final option that I want to touch on here today, of course, like I said, there are plenty of options, is home-built fencing. And this is actually what I use at most of my donation gardens that I work with. This pile, particularly in the picture, is used as fenced in with 3 leftover pallets that were given to us because they were laying around not used. This is as simple as it can be, using old wood, old pallets, maybe you got a little bit of extra fencing. If you build your own, it really keeps that cost low, and you can customize it exactly to your needs. If you needed an 8-foot wide by 3-foot tall, it might be difficult to find that commercially, but you can build that on your own. So it's just what you're looking for. There is one specific bin system that I wanted to take a second to highlight because it's interesting to me. It's a method. It's used for efficiency when it comes to using compost that's ready to go. It's the 3-bin system, and it's meant to keep compost that's broken down and ready to go separate from any fresh plants that you're going to be adding as you go along. So we'll take, for example, you set up a 3-bin system, say this spring, before we have any sort of plant matter that needs to go in there. You start with 3 bins. It could be 5 bins, 6 bins. We'll start with 3. You'll put the freshest plants in the first bin, and you'll add to that for a week or 2 until you get it good and full, and then you'll roll it over to the second one and then stop adding. That second bin will then work on its own to break down, to decompose, while you're adding your freshest vegetable and plant matter in the first bin. And then you repeat that process in 1 to 2, maybe 3 weeks, and move the second bin to the third bin and the first to the second, and so on. So that way, in your third bin, after a month or 2, you have completely broken down compost without having all of that extra fresh plant matter. Then once that is completely broken down in the third bin, you can take that out and use it. It's just a way to keep your freshest greens separate from compost that may be ready to use in the middle of the season, rather than waiting for all of it to be ready at the very, very end. Again, it's just another option. Composting is a very loose and just guideline type of process. Excuse me. More importantly, what goes into the compost is far more important than how it's set up. When it comes to composting, there is the perfect recipe, and there's 4 major parts that all should be proportional to each other. We have the green matter, the brown matter, the water, and the oxygen. Now, when I say green matter, it brings to mind green matter, and that's exactly what it is. We say this, but we mean it's the nitrogen component of the compost. So that's going to be your grass clippings, your spent vegetable plants, spent flowers, any sort of, say, like cucumber trimmings or carrot trimmings from your kitchen. That is going to be your green matter. The nitrogen is like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the microbes that are in your compost pile that drive that decomposition. So this is what they burn, this is what they work up very, very quickly, so you can add a lot and it will break down very, very quickly. Compared to the brown matter, which is our carbon source, and just like the green matter, it gets its name from what you add. The brown matter, or carbon, comes from things such as straw or wood chips or sawdust or pieces of newspaper, things that take longer to break down because carbon takes longer to break down than the nitrogen does, meaning that's going to sustain the life of those microbes longer than the nitrogen is. So the nitrogen is their all-you-can-eat buffet, but their carbon is their energy bar. It is what they return to when they've burned through all of the nitrogen. These two need to be proportionate to each other because they need enough carbon to fall back on, but they don't, there should not be enough carbon that it takes over the pile. The ratio of nitrogen to carbon atoms is for every 1 nitrogen, there should be 30 carbon. It's not expected that you go out and you measure your pile to make sure you have 1 nitrogen and 30 carbon atoms. I'm not sure there's even a test for that for home gardeners. But the best way you can do this is for every 1 amount of green matter, say a wheelbarrow full, you add 2 of that brown matter. So if I added 1 wheelbarrow full of grass clippings or tomato plants, then I would do my best to add roughly 2 wheelbarrows of, say, sawdust or broken up sticks or maybe newspaper. Just enough so that once they burn all that green matter up, there's still carbon there for them to use. So those green to brown needs to be proportional. And then the arguably more important balance is the water to oxygen ratio in the pile. You need both water and oxygen, but once it gets too much water in the system, there is no room for that air to be in there. Microbes, just like us, need air and oxygen to breathe, to function, to decompose, and produce the compost that we're wanting to use. So it's important to have a moist environment to heat up the pile and feed those microbes. But if you have a sopping wet pile, that's when you're going to get those bad smells. It's going to smell like rotting eggs and sulfury and not something that you're going to want or be appealing at all. Once you have your green matter, brown matter, and your water and your oxygen all in balance of each other, you have a perfect compost pile that will be efficient and ready to use by the end of the season. Now, there are a couple guidelines to follow for what you put in and what you don't. Here are some examples. These lists are much, much longer, but these are just some examples that I grabbed. Great examples of what to put in are young weeds with no seed heads, disease-free plants that are done producing, any sort of vegetable trimmings, chopped leaves, and the non-glossy newspaper. I specify non-glossy because some of those shoppers are very, very colorful and they're shiny. That coating will not break down. However, a traditional non-glossy newspaper is biodegradable ink and can be broken down in a compost pile. There are more examples, but this is just to get you started. The more important one that I wanted to focus on here are what not to put in the pile. I mentioned the young weeds with no seed heads because weeds with mature seed heads that go into a pile, once you spread that compost pile back out, you're just going to be reseeding those weeds. Most home compost piles do not get hot enough to kill seeds. That is typically only happening in commercial composting. So by putting those mature seeds back in, you're just going to be planting them in your garden again, and you'll be starting from what you were fighting anyway. And that's the same thing with the disease. Last year, for example, we were really, really wet in some of my gardens, so my tomatoes had horrible issues with blight. So when I pulled those plants out, I made sure that I did not put those in the compost pile and instead took them to the local yard waste landscaping landfill, where the heat would get high enough that it would kill those spores because our pile was not big enough to do so. The next two, I mentioned kitchen scraps, but I do not mean meat scraps or dairy products. These are filled with oils and more complex molecules that take longer to break down, and when they do, they emit that odor. So I mentioned that you may have an odor with a compost pile that's too wet. If you're also adding meat and dairy scraps, this is where you're going to attract that unwanted wildlife, stray cats, stray dogs, and you're also going to get that rotting food smell because the fats and the more complex compounds are breaking down and they release that stench. The last one I wanted to mention, just in this instance, there's more that you should be aware of when you're adding, but these are just my quick snapshot. Whole sticks and large chunks of wood will not break down as quickly as you are going to want you to use your compost. So typically try to keep sticks between 1 to 4 inches long. Anything longer than that, snap it in half before you throw it in, or any big chunks of, say, for example, firewood, that would be something to stack next to the side and not throw in with your pile. That's will take far too long for your microbes to break down efficiently. So there's your do's and your don'ts. And I keep talking about this component of breaking down, of feeding the microbes and doing this for the microbes and making sure they have air. And that brings me to the science of it. I'm a scientist at heart. I want to know the why behind everything. So why do all of this just to make sure some plants break down? Well, microbes are the driving force of decomposition. So as long as we have them in the system and we keep them happy, we will have efficient compost production, we will have efficient decomposition happening, and overall we will just have a much more nutrient-dense end product of compost. Now, we can't see these by their name, they're micro, they're very, very small, but we have several signs of when they are working and if they are working properly. And one of the biggest ones of this in a compost pile specifically is that it's hot. If you were to turn your compost pile and you put your hand just over the edge of it and you felt heat coming off of the pile itself, that's a good sign. If it's smoking, that is a problem, but you want it to be hot. About 140 degrees is the gold temperature for composting. That is when decomposition is at its most efficient. It's breaking down as quickly as possible, and those microbes are the happiest, is about 140 degrees. Excuse me. And contrary to what you might intuitively think, turning the compost pile or sticking a pitchfork in and turning the inside to the outside and the bottom to the top actually increases the heat. You might think it would cool it off because it opens it up, but actually it introduces fresh oxygen, it introduces fresh plant material, and it allows you a chance to check on how much moisture is in your pile. So also contrary to what you might initially think, a little bit of moisture in that pile will also contribute to building that heat. If you have a bone dry pile, you can remedy that by lightly spraying it with a garden hose, or you can add more of your green matter, more of your nitrogen source. That is typically very water dense and will break down and provide that moisture to the system while also feeding your microbes. So you have your heat, and you also have, as a sign of working microbes, as a gas release. The one that you want to smell, and it will not smell strongly, is the ammonia. If you think of bleach, that's ammonia, it's NH3. That means they're breaking down those nitrogen sources and releasing it as a gas back into the atmosphere. Now, you don't want to be walking up and smell ammonia and have it burning your nose hairs. That's not what we're going for. But if you smell it and you have that light scent of that process happening, that means those microbes are happy, they're decomposing away, and they are good to go. On the other side, you do not want to smell that methane gas, kind of that rotten egg smell, decomposing, rotting matter. That is CH4, and what that's a sign of, I mentioned it shows that you have too much water in the system. That's because they are going through what's called anaerobic decomposition, meaning that there is no oxygen in the system for these microbes to use. So they are slowing down their decomposition, and instead they are using a slower process called methagenesis to produce methane, and that's when you get that smelly compost pile. I had the perfect example of this kind of by accident with this photo I have here. I did my little compost in a jar experiment. The jar in the far right with the red lid, I started back in February, And you can see that it went from all the way from the top of the jar. Now it is broken down into what's called Gardener's Black Gold, our lovely compost. And that's dried out. It is not breaking down anymore. I can throw that out into the garden or into a flower pot as I see fit. It is perfectly ready. And then on the opposite side, we have the left-hand one that was created on Monday, actually. If you want to see how I make it, I'm going to give you a little self-plug. I have a solo Master Gardener Facebook page, and I did a little video spot on how to create your own compost in a jar. So I created that one on Monday, and that has our green matter, our brown matter, and I added just a little bit of water to get it going. So that's a fresh jar. But unfortunately, talking about methane, that middle jar has too much liquid in it. So anytime I move it, shake it, dump off some of that extra liquid, I get hit with a lovely burst of methane. And now that it's served its purpose for me, it will be going out into my compost pile to hopefully dry out just a little bit and stop smelling. So if you have that stinky compost pile, spread it out a little bit, do not water it, try to work some of that moisture out if you can. So you have all of these parts, and most importantly, of course, I have to say it one more time, you have the microbes. Microbes drive that decomposition. They are the most important thing. So as long as you keep them happy, you will have an excellent compost pile. And since I'm an agronomist, I have to talk about why we compost and why we apply compost to our gardens, and how does that actually help us. We know it puts some nutrients back into the system that help our plants, but also in the same vein of those microbes, we're feeding the biology of the soil. And just to give you an idea of how alive our soil is, while yes, we have worms and insects and roots in the soil, we also have billions and billions of microbes living in every handful of soil. If you were to take a scoop of soil that filled your hand, maybe roughly a cup, we have more microbes in that 1 unit of soil than we have people on Earth. So over 7-8 billion people, microbes living in one handful of soil. So they have a huge impact on how productive our gardens are and how happy our plants will be in that soil. So if we keep those microbes happy, we feed them with that compost, then we will increase our own productivity. It also, not only does it help that biology and we reapply some of those nutrients that those plants that we broke down took up, we also increase our moisture retention, drainage, and overall quality of our garden soil. We till it, typically till it every year. I know very few people who do no-till gardens, but we typically till it every year, and that breaks down the soil structure. So it increases the moisture retention and drainage. While these actually seem counterintuitive, they seem counterproductive, they're actually not. They go right hand in hand. The compost increases the health of the soil structure, meaning that it has the ability to not only hold the moisture it needs, but let the excess it doesn't need drain through. If you think of it like a soil structure, like an apartment building, we have rooms for water and we have room for air. Plant roots need both, and a healthy soil structure will be able to hold water while also providing air for those roots to grow. Now, the unfortunate side of composting is that it takes patience. You're not going to see an immediate change in your soil structure or soil health after 1 year of application. Most research suggests it takes 3 to 4 to 5 years to really start to see that improvement in moisture retention and drainage and overall quality of the soil that will help you during drought periods, also in addition to heavy rains. So even though we have to be patient, composting is extremely valuable when it comes to helping the health of our soil, and the healthier our soil is, the more it will, the happier our plants will be in it and the more productive they will be for us. So overall, it'll make you a more productive gardener. So we've gone through all of the science, the soil, the recipe. Now let's see if we can answer the questions we started with. So the 4 questions we asked in the beginning: what do you need? What makes the compost? How does it work? And why should you compost? And I've broken it down into the most simple answers I can possibly think of. What do you need? All you need are plants and space. What makes up the compost? We have that perfect recipe of green, brown, water, and air. As long as it's not too wet and you don't have too much carbon, it is perfectly good to go. How does it work? The short answer is microbes. Microbes, microbes, microbes are the most important thing. And then finally that question, why should you compost? The easiest answer is to help the soil, and in turn, that will help you. All of this together makes composting worth it. It reduces the amount of waste going into landfills. It helps you, and it just gives you a chance to watch science in action, which for me, I think that's pretty awesome to do. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. If you wanted to send me an email or give me a call, I've got my contact information right there. That is my office phone number, and I'm working from home, but if you give it a call, a message will eventually get to me. If you want a quicker response, I highly suggest emailing. Also, the Master Gardener page that I mentioned earlier is SOLO for my 4 counties on Facebook, and I post a weekly little 1 to 2 minute video on something related to horticulture. So feel free to check those out. And do we have any questions?
Don, this is Carolyn. We do have some questions for you that have come across. One person says, I have a commercial bin, but it doesn't seem to break material down fast enough. And as I continue to add, it only creates less finished product at the same time. Can you talk a little bit about size of bin maybe, and a little bit more about those kinds of things? Because I think like I have a small commercial bin and I don't think it works super well. I think I like an open one better. So you want to talk a little bit more about those kinds of things?
You were breaking in, so make sure I understood what you're asking. They have a commercial bin, but it's not breaking down as quickly?
Correct.
Okay. With commercial bins, researching and understanding exactly what you need, one of the biggest things that I've seen with commercial bins is they don't allow moisture to get out of the system quick enough. And so with that excess moisture and water breakdown in the system, it slows that whole process down. So if you have, say, it's one of the plastic ones that's up off the ground on a stand, attempting to drill some extra drainage holes in there would help with that process. If it's on the ground, anything to do out the sides with getting a little bit more air movement in there will help speed up that process. The more air you can add into the system, in addition to that excess moisture, is going to help break things down faster. Is that what they were?
I am guessing that's what they wanted.
Okay.
Somebody asked about fruit skins and putting them in the compost pile.
Yep, fruit skins are great. They are just regular old plant material. They would be included in the nitrogen even though they aren't technically always green.
Another person asked about adding some soil in with it.
Excellent question. So I talked about there being microbes and biology in the soil, and a great way to get those microbes a jump start in your compost pile is to add a little bit of garden soil. If you add too much to your system, it's going to cake it up and make it clayey, and that will hold excess moisture, again, slowing down the process and not letting enough air in there. So if you have a 5-gallon bucket full of, I'll use the wheelbarrow. I've been using the wheelbarrow. If you have a wheelbarrow full of plant matter, adding just a sprinkle of soil across the top of the wheelbarrow before dumping it in will be enough. You don't really want to add it by the shovelful, otherwise it'll get too cakey.
Along those same lines, what about adding used potting soil?
That is a great option that provides a carbon source, especially those, I assume you're talking about the soilless peat mixes. So those don't actually typically contain much soil or any soil at all. So adding those in is a great option to give your pile a kickstart when it gets going.
We have another question about grass clippings that have been fertilized.
Yes, that is another, that the chemically treated, whether it's fertilizer or pesticide, tends to fall on the do not add side. But when you, let me get my words straight here. After you've applied a fertilizer or a pesticide to a lawn, it's typically recommended that you wait 3 to 4 cuttings of the grass before beginning to add that back into your compost pile. So if you freshly applied fertilizer, I would collect those or leave them on the lawn, and I would collect them and take them somewhere else, or I would just leave them on the lawn, because introducing that chemical into your compost pile will not only end up back on your garden, it will also hurt the system that the microbes have created. Same goes with pesticide treated plants in the garden.
What about adding manure to a compost pile? And if you do, what timing should that be?
So adding manure to a compost pile is another, as many of us know, manure is extremely nutrient dense. And the most important thing with adding any type of manure is letting it neutralize before we put it back onto what we're going to use it for. So the best recommendation that I tend to follow is adding it in. You can add it through the season as long as you're not going to use your compost pile, and then spreading it out onto the garden before winter and letting it go through several freeze-thaw cycles before spring. That way, any concern with the manure has typically been reduced and you are good to go using it on the garden. So you can add it throughout the season, but letting it go through those freeze-thaw cycles, since home compost piles do not get hot enough to kill any sort of bacteria that is going to be in that manure.
We do have another question about, you had talked about using newspaper. What about shredded office paper?
Shredded office paper would be great. The biggest concern with the newspaper or office paper would be what type of ink is on it. If it's coated with colored ink, I would probably avoid that. But if it is just plain office paper with black text on it, shredded office paper is an excellent carbon source for those microbes. They just eat that right up.
That's all the questions we have at this point. While people are thinking of other questions, I would like to remind the participants that Caitlin has put up the evaluation for Dawn's presentation. So if you'll go to the chat box, you can copy and paste that into a browser. And if you would do that evaluation for us, we would appreciate it. She also included her email and Dawn's email if you have any questions that you would like to go ahead and answer them. Let me check and see if there's more questions here. Glenda says, I have wet compost from last year. Will this benefit my garden? I have leaves that I can add.
So it's leftover compost from last year and it would be a little wet. If you were to spread it out onto your garden and till it in this spring yet, that would be great because it's had that the winter, even though the process has been slower, it still has been slowly breaking down this winter. So if you were to spread it out and incorporate it into your garden, that would be very beneficial this spring. So yes, you can use it.
Another question about how often should you turn or stir your compost pile?
So typically the easiest schedule I follow is once a month, but you can turn it anywhere up from once a week to 2 to 4 weeks. I wouldn't let it go much longer than a month without turning it, but starting at about 2 weeks is the best time frame.
So just a curious question as your phone rings where you're at. Do you use the 3 bin system in the gardens that you do, or do you use a single bin system?
At 2 of the gardens, we have a single bin system. At our Sanborn Garden location this year, we are setting up a 3 bin system to use, especially since it's also a community garden. So we have a lot of compost coming in. And so we'll be experimenting to see how many bins we actually do need and how well we can roll it through and get people to stick to that fresh 2-week, 1-month system. Great question.
It'll be interesting to see that. I haven't seen that in action myself, so I would be interested to find out.
I'll be taking plenty of pictures.
All right, I'm going to follow your Facebook page so I can see. Another question about leaves being shredded. Is it better to shred the leaves?
Yes. Shredding the leaves gives the microbes that rough edge to get going, that decomposition process, a little bit quicker. So if you were to collect them with the lawnmower and mulch them just a little bit before you dump them in, they would be able to break down just a little bit faster, so you don't end up with whole leaves in your garden the next year.
Okay. And then another question also about eggshells and adding eggshells to your compost bin, and it seems like the eggshells don't break down as fast as the rest of it.
Eggshells do take longer to break down, but that's another item that would be beneficial to crunch them up a little bit before you throw them in, just because they're so calcium dense, and that takes a little bit longer for those microbes to get through. So if you were to crush them up before you threw them into your pile, they would break down just a little bit faster.
All right, that is the ones that we have. I'm going to go to Caitlin. I'm not sure if she can unmute herself, so I'm going to unmute you, Caitlin. And if you want to chat with us, please do.
Yeah, I did just see another one that came in. Don, somebody asked if they can put coffee grounds directly into the garden.
Yes, yes, you can. That's counted as a carbon source because they are a bit more complex to break down, but yes, you can.
Awesome. And then I'll give people just a second if they want to ask any other questions. I'll kind of go back to my VRS comment before I kind of, my Zoom stopped working on me. So just to let all the Iowa Master Gardeners know, if your VRS system is not working, go ahead and try using it on a Google Chrome. Again, those tutorial videos are coming. I don't know how far I got along on my talk before it went out on me and I had to text Don. So just a reminder, go ahead and try that internet change and that might help. And then somebody asked, what page does Don have, website or Facebook? So do you want to share your solo master gardener information again, Don?
Yeah, we have for solo, the Sue O'Brien line, Osceola, that's what makes up the solo. Master Gardeners, we have a Facebook page and an Instagram. I post the little videos to Facebook, and all of our updates go up on the Facebook page. So you can find us at SOLO_Master Gardener.
Now quick, just toss that link into the chat box for everyone.
Perfect, thank you, Caitlin.
Then you can stay up to date with Dawn. She does all these minute to grow videos that have been really great. So make sure to watch for those. Does anybody else have any last questions for Dawn before we wrap up today?
Just a question, the solo, does it have an underscore before it says Master Gardeners?
If you search on Facebook at SOLO_Master Gardener, it will pop up. Yep.
Okay.
Or you can follow the link Caitlin just posted, and we're not too hard to find.
Perfect, perfect. We do have one more question. What is a way to enhance a raised bed for tomatoes? And how often does the dirt need to be changed?
So with raised beds, if you are continuing to add that compost every year, you shouldn't need to change the soil out, or otherwise, I've heard roughly anywhere from 5 to 8 years is when you really need to start paying attention to the soil in those raised beds and making sure it's not getting too overused and becoming more detrimental than helpful to your plants. And enhancing them for tomatoes, again, adding compost, things with a little extra calcium, making sure that they aren't getting too much nitrogen or not enough water. Tomatoes can be pretty picky about their water, so that would be the first thing I would take a look at.
Awesome. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Dawn at dawnh@iastate.edu. You scroll up in the chat, I did link her email there as well. And then also you can reach out to me via email if you need to reach out to Dawn so I can get you guys connected. Dawn, thank you so much for joining. Always love getting to work with you.
Thank you for having me.